considerate of the goals of the UW System Board of Regents that he's willing to start his presentation and allow us to finish eating, which is very nice of him to do, so we can make the best use of our time. Did you want to do any further introduction?
No, without further ado, I give you Senior Vice President Mash. Well, to lead off the tuition and financial aid discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Board of Regents, ladies and gentlemen, in a few minutes, my colleagues, Debbie Durkin, Frida Harris, Sharon Wilhelm, will take you through a PowerPoint presentation that essentially gets at the essence of the Financial Aid Advisory Group's work. I want to make just a couple of comments, if I could, to try to create some sort of a context for the discussion that might follow and then the action that lies ahead. Public higher education is to promote the public good. Now, of late, we are saying more about the individual benefit as opposed to the public benefit. But this is about Wisconsin's future. And that's the reason the state invests in public higher education. We have a challenge. Wisconsin has a challenge. Just to make it simple, Wisconsin requires more degrees to move forward, not only in terms of economic vitality, but also quality of life. We have proposed a growth agenda. And the growth agenda is our effort to attempt to do and provide what Wisconsin requires. Now, we have a financial capacity issue. A financial capacity that, if we are successful with the growth agenda, and that means enrolling and supporting and educating at a quality level more students, and, as President Riley says, getting a deeper and wider cut of young people who aren't coming forward today, then we will require additional financial capacity for our operating budgets as well as for need-based financial aid. Tuition is a lever, a mechanism. When I became chancellor at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire approximately 10 years ago, and I looked at our educational and general budget, it was funded approximately 1/3, 33%, by tuition revenues, and the remainder by state GPR support. Today, 33% as a part of the budget provided by tuition has now become 45%. So tuition has become a larger and larger portion of the educational and general budget of all of our campuses. And we know that, and we know there's a direct relationship between the level of state support and the level of tuition that we charge. And you have been, and you and your predecessors have been, in the position of having to make decisions about what level of tuition we should charge, even in the face of very, very severe budget cuts. And how much tuition could we charge to backfill some of that, still maintain quality, still move forward with the kinds of things this public university system is expected to do, and Wisconsin needs it to do. When we think about tuition, then, as a piece of the puzzle, we know that there is a relationship to affordability and access. So this is a tuition and financial aid examination because the two are related. We're a low aid state. We're also a relatively low tuition state. If I were to show you a slide of UW-Madison and its peers, UW-Milwaukee and its peers, and the comprehensives and their peers, take about 15 of them, you would see each of our institutions down to
Graduation and retention rates. How do we ensure that we have adequate resources to do all that? Now I'll turn it over to Associate Vice President Frida Harris to define and describe the various tuition options we considered.
The tuition and financial aid work group can look at and consider as they're thinking about the educational options for the children. It could also be based upon multiple different things. You could base it upon the cost of education at an institution, market demand for that particular institution, pure median tuition that's being charged, or upon goals that are established by the board, such as access goals. In addition, it could allow funding to be generated that could be used throughout the system at multiple institutions. And it also provides funding that could be used for a wide range of needs that would be established or determined by the institution or by the Board of Regents. Some of the cons were that because a lot of students tend to go to institutions that are closer to their home, it could create a system that would reward or punish students based upon where they live. There could be a perception that higher tuition means higher quality, lower tuition means lower quality. There could be some negative impacts on low-income families if we do not provide sufficient financial aid to maintain access. Another consideration with this was how could the board retain the revenues generated by doing greater tuition stratification, given the limitations that we have in the statutes on tuition revenue. Differential tuition was the second option that we looked at. Differential tuition is an amount that is added to, and in some cases, reduced from the standard rate that has been approved by the board. And an example of where it was decreased was with the tri-state initiative for UW-Plaxo. It can be either for a campus, for all the students at a campus, or it could be for a program. And so we have differentials in both types of cases. Differentials must be approved by the Board of Regents, and under current policy, it involves input from student groups. The funding must be used for the specific purposes, and in most cases, it's a rather narrow range of specific purposes that are approved by the board when the differential itself is approved. Some of the pros of that are that it can be used to address high priority items with the campus or with the students. The money remains at that particular institution and is not distributed to other institutions. It could provide some additional revenues that could be used to help with financial aid when a differential causes additional tuition increases. So you would try to offset the impact on low-income families. The Board of Regents also has the authority to implement differential tuition, and the system can retain those revenues. Some of the downsides were that there's not necessarily any additional GPR committed for financial aid to offset, so a reason for considering using the differential revenues themselves. It may be difficult to understand why there are differences between the campuses. The willingness of the students on an institution and the areas of interest for those students determine the amount that the differential is and the purposes. So there's not necessarily any reason why, other than that, you might have a differential at one campus versus another. And the other is that it could be used in some cases or perceived to be used as a way of offsetting GPR support that has declined over time. We looked at per credit tuition, and currently we have in place at the UW system per credit tuition up to 12 credits, and then the per credit resumes after the 18th credit. This can create some equity issues because full-time students who take credits within 13 to 18 credit range, which we call our plateau, get the benefit of some free credits. Some options that we had considered would be either to charge for every credit, so everyone is paying the same rate for every credit they consume, or to narrow the plateau so that instead of being from the 13 to 18 being free, you might have a smaller band of credits that would be charged that way. If per credit rate was lowered, it would provide equity for part-time students, and it might increase affordability for adults who want to come to the university. Institutions could receive full funding for every credit that they have, even when you're working with a collaborative program. Right now, there are some times where revenue has to be split between institutions for the additional credits. Some concerns were related to financial aid and whether or not grant aid could increase or would increase when there's more than 12 credits taken. Paying for each credit might also limit the number of depth and breadth credits that students take, because right now there's an opportunity for them to explore within the plateau. Once that is removed and you're paying for every credit, students might decide not to take so many breadth courses. And it could result in taking a longer time to degree. The potential there is that students might take the number of courses they can afford within their budget, as opposed to looking at how many you need to complete your degree in a timely fashion, and that could then slow down the progress to degree. The last one that I'll talk about is cohort tuition. Cohort tuition is a rate that is applied to a group of students, generally entering freshmen and transfer students, that's different from the rate paid by other students. This rate could be a guarantee where the student will pay the same rate for a period of time, which could be 4 to 5 years, or they could be guaranteed a maximum increase in any year, sometimes tied to the CPI or some inflationary factor. The rate paid at the start of the cohort program generally incorporates sufficient funding to cover the anticipated increases that a student might have had, plus the interest amounts that will be generated off the dollars that have been paid. So some of the pros of this are that it does allow families to do better planning for the costs related to higher education. There's an incentive to complete your degree within the time frame that you have the guarantee, because after that the rate could go up substantially. And it could increase capacity by shortening time to degree. Some of the cons were that you're assuming that you're going to have steady GPR, and without a compact with the state, you could end up with very different tuition rates, because once it's fully implemented, the only area you can adjust the tuition with is the new entering freshman class. It's complicated to implement and manage, and students who don't graduate during the fixed tuition guarantee could experience a large increase after that. Another issue for the UW system is that we cannot currently retain interest off of tuition, which is a way of buying down the cost of this with some other systems. So the challenge that the university system faces is a delicate balancing act between the amount of GPR support we receive and the amount of tuition that we charge in order to have sufficient resources to cover the total cost of educating the students we enroll. In an ideal world, GPR, or state support, would cover everything, but we don't live in an ideal world. So when the UW system was created, GPR covered about 75% of the total cost of education. Then for a long time, we were at a place where the state resources covered about 65% of the cost of education. Now we're down to the point where it's 50% of the cost is covered by the state and the other 50% is covered through tuition. So our question is, what is the appropriate cost sharing between students and the state for a public university? And if GPR support is challenged and tuition does increase, how can we ensure access to low and middle income students? So I'll turn it over to Interim Associate Vice President Wilhelm to talk about the importance of financial aid when we're looking at tuition options.
Proportion of low-income undergraduates in the UW system and the need to increase access. Using the percentage of undergraduate enrollments who receive a Pell Grant as a measure of serving low-income students, the UW system enrolls a significantly smaller percentage than seen nationally. 21% of UW undergraduates are low-income, compared to 31% at public four-year institutions nationally. While the national trend has seen increases in the proportions of enrolled low-income students, the UW system has seen the opposite. Over the last 10 years, the proportion of low-income undergraduates has decreased 5 percentage points, from 26% to 21%. In addition, for those who attend college, a growing number are financing their education with student loans. Last year, UW students borrowed $626 million in student loans, an amount that doubled in the last 10 years. The average student debt upon graduation for those who borrowed now stands at over $21,000. Affordability is a key component of getting more people in and through college. One option discussed by the working group to maintain affordability was to use tuition to fund financial aid. This would result in less reliance on state and federal budget constraints and potentially shifting budgetary priorities. Tuition revenues would provide a steady and consistent stream of revenues for financial aid. Financial aid programs could be tailored by institutions to meet the needs of specific students. Tuition could be raised and set at a market rate or a rate that is comparable to peer institutions. This approach allows tuition to be tied to students' ability to pay. That is, students who can afford to pay a higher percentage of their education costs would do so, and a portion of the revenues generated would be used for financial aid, thus providing access for students who cannot afford to pay the cost of an education. On the other hand, this approach could shift the focus away from GPR-funded financial aid programs such as WAG towards a reliance on tuition-funded programs. Higher income students would be required to subsidize lower income students through higher tuition. This higher tuition could create a sticker shock for lower and middle income students. Students who are uncertain if they would qualify for additional financial aid may be discouraged from applying to a UW institution. This approach to funding financial aid would be a shift to a more private university model at a public institution. There's already some very beneficial work being done to address access to higher education in Wisconsin. For example, this year, the UW WEG program, the largest need-based state grant program, increased from $43 million to $50 million. This has resulted in a maximum grant award increase of $130 for this academic year. In addition, the Wisconsin Covenant Scholars Program will help meet the financial needs of students who complete the program's requirements. However, the first cohort of Covenant Scholars will not enter higher education until 2012, and the working group discussed the need to expand access and opportunity prior to 2012. Therefore, the working group supports and is asking the board to endorse a bridge program that would assist financially needy students who are currently enrolled or about to enroll in the UW system by holding them harmless against tuition increases. Further details of this proposal can be found in Appendix E of the report. The working group discussed the benefit of having an overall framework or principles for financial aid as tuition options are being considered. This is consistent with what the board heard a few years ago during a presentation from Joni Finney, a national expert from the National Center of Public Policy and Higher Education, who spoke on the importance of ensuring that college attendance remains affordable to students from all socioeconomic groups. One of her recommendations was that tuition and financial aid policies and decisions should be made as a coherent package. She suggested that the UW system would benefit from having a set of financial aid policy principles to complement our tuition policies. The working group approved a statement of support for a draft financial aid policy principles. Briefly, the draft principles state that socioeconomic diversity enhances the learning environment for all students and bolsters state economic growth. That student recruitment, retention, and degree completion is most successful when financial barriers are eliminated. High unmet financial need undermines the expectation and plans of both low and moderate income students. Student loan debt should remain reasonable so that students are not limited in their options of major, postgraduate education, and career choice. And lastly, it is essential to provide a clear message to young students and their parents prior to high school that college is possible and within reach, regardless of their family circumstances, cultural background, or financial resources. The full text of these principles can be found in Appendix D of the report. That ends my comments.
So in conclusion, the group concluded that differential tuition is a good thing. It remains at the campus, helps to fund individual campus or programmatic priorities, and it involves students in the decision-making process. It's a very useful tool. Stratification is already in place within the UW system, and increased stratification could be used strategically to advance the goals of the growth agenda. We do not expect all institutions to move in lockstep together, and campuses should be encouraged to explore the options that might be the best fit within their particular mission. The current statutory language provisions on undergraduate tuition limit the board's ability to raise tuition for amounts included in the state budget or included as part of a biennial budget initiative, amounts for pay plan, any projected loss in revenue due to enrollment changes, state-imposed costs, distance education, non-traditional and intersession courses, and differential tuition approved by the board. The advisory group felt the board should have full authority, along with the responsibility, to set tuition for all groups of students. We approved a statement of support for financial aid policy principles and hope at a future meeting that you will also. And we also approved a statement of support for a hold harmless bridge program for our neediest students. And again, we hope at a future meeting you will also approve that statement. So with that, we turn it back to President Riley.
Thank you, Deb. Don, anything further you want to add right now? Or?
No, I don't think so. I think that the report's been covered and the general frame hopefully has been explained well, and be happy to respond to questions and engage in discussion.
All right, I think we're open for questions, discussion, reaction. Why don't we start at this side this time? See? All right. Anybody going down the line with Regent Bartel?
Well, I would just like to discuss a little more the what the committee felt were the cons, the real negatives to reducing the plateau, the credit plateau between 12, it's now what, 12 to 18 or something like that. What would be wrong with raising that the lower boundary to 15, which is the number of credits it takes, doesn't it, to take a full load and graduate in 4 years? Is that am I correct? And then having a much narrower band of free credits.
The group was concerned that, the one concern that they had was that by raising it to 15, there might be some people who decided not to go to the 15 credits that you needed in order to complete in, the 8 semesters that you would be able to do that. With the 12 to 18 band that we currently have, the students will take more credits, and again, with the 15 credits a semester, they could complete in the 8 semesters. In most cases, if the band was narrowed and there was some reduction in the per credit rate, there might not be a problem. So that, again, that was the only concern, was that it could increase the time to degree slightly.
That makes a lot of sense to me.
One of the other concerns was the impact on grant aid, since 12 credits qualifies you as a full-time student. And so then if you went up to 15 credits, you wouldn't qualify for any more grant aid. Now your package would change, if I'm correct, Sharon, so that you would qualify potentially for more loans to make up that difference, but not an additional grant. But we did specifically discuss the benefits of tying it to 15 credits because of degree completion, and that would sort of tie your tuition policy to another goal of completing your degree in 4 years.
Thank you. Regent Davis, or let's see, Regent Berman. Okay, Regent Davis.
I heard, excuse me, 4 statistics that make me come away from this discussion with being absolutely convinced of a need of urgency to address the issues of affordability. When I hear that 3 of these are going in the wrong direction and 1 is going in the wrong direction for another reason, if I got the stats right. 66% debt upon graduation, 26% increase in debt, 53% of the students borrowing. Those statistics I heard from Sharon. And then I listened to another statistic that says 21% of low-income students, 21% of our students are low income as compared to a 31% national average. One's going down, ours, as compared to one going up. And I look at all of that, and I listen to all of that, and I say to myself, we're going in the wrong direction in terms of a growth agenda. If as a tenet of it or a component of it, we are expecting to increase the number of baccalaureate degrees, this is really, should be disturbed. We should really, really, really be disturbed. And I come away with, I'd support a Hold Harmless Bridge Grant program if that's going to make sure that we are doing something to ensure that our students can afford to go to college in this state. And I support the financial aid principles because they're the right ones. But what I'm hoping that we don't do is drag our feet, because these statistics indicate that we have some clear issues for the state of Wisconsin when it comes to affordability for college. I am just so emotionally just distraught to hear this, and I would hope that we're going to, move forward with deliberate speed to begin to address in a real way these trends, because they're not the right ones.
Going down this way, Regent Thomas.
Someone else has a comment right now.
Someone else? Okay, Regent Walsh, you have your hand up.
I have a couple questions. When we talk about low income, what's our distinction between the 18-year-old student and the parent's income? Is the definition of low income the family they come from or the individual?
It depends on if they're determined to be independent or dependent.
So we're back to the IRS.
No, that determination is federal regulations from the Department of Education.
And what is the distinction? What is it? Give me an example of one student.
You are, by default, dependent until you're the age of, I believe it's 23 or 24. I'm pretty sure it's 20. Is it 24? So you're automatically dependent until you become of age of 24, unless you are a single parent, a ward of the courts. There's a couple exceptions to that, but pretty much you're dependent on your family until the age.
So when we talk in these terms, we're talking about the family, not the student, generally.
For dependent
Okay,
students.
now then the second question is on the... I'm sorry?
Both.
Yeah, it's both. Then, how comfortable are we with the information we're receiving?
What we're doing... That's a very good
from the
question,
family.
Regent Walsh. What we're doing here is transitioning to a new metric to monitor low-incomeness in our student body, where we used to, still do, produce quintile information that used the ACT data, which is what you've asked about in the past, and that's self-reported by the student as they fill out the ACT application. We have moved away from that to a new metric called using the percentage of enrollments that receive the Pell Grant, and that's a nationally accepted metric that allows us to compare us to other states and other universities, and that eligibility for the Pell Grant takes into account the FAFSA information that is submitted by families and tied to the tax information.
Okay, I guess when I ask how comfortable you are, I'm not sure I heard that answer, but what you're saying is that we are using the information that certain families have submitted in support of Pell Grants.
For any financial aid.
For any.
Yes.
And so if they don't submit it, they're definitely not included in the low income.
Right.
Even though they may be low income.
Right. So these
Then
numbers, while they're disturbing, could be understated by someone.
That's correct. And then the other question is do we have any sense of those that don't apply for aid for whatever reason, how many more would be in there?
I don't have any sense of who's not applying.
Let me follow up. If we have data on people who have loans, where do we get that data?
Same source.
So there's probably people that might have loans from other sources than the sources you're looking at.
If a student would like to receive a student loan, a federally subsidized student loan, they have to apply through the FAFSA, through the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
If they go to a private bank and choose an alternative loan, then they don't have to go through that process. Typically, though, the financial aid offices highly encourage students to apply through the federally subsidized programs because the interest rates are so much better and the loans are so much better managed that if they see anybody that's pursuing an alternative loan, they strongly intervene and suggest they apply.
Last question. Then, do you feel that there's a group out there that don't ask for loans because they go out and get a job instead? All of them having the same family backgrounds because they need money. Do you have a feel for that? How many are working and not borrowing money?
I don't know if any of the individual institutions. I would say probably they're both working and taking out loans. Because even as you max out loans, you still have unmet need that you can't get through any other aid. So I would suspect that that's where they get that resource.
No, I'm talking about people who don't borrow because they're in that gray area, and by working they can do it. They're still coming from the same type of family. Mm-hmm. We just don't have any grasp of that yet. Just increase the problem.
In my experience, I'm a house fellow, so I've talked to some residents about this and talked with friends. Typically, people who have financial need will apply for the FAFSA and try to get free money, so grants, and if they don't get that, they may choose not to take the loans because they don't want to borrow. I also know a number of people who will apply for the FAFSA in their first year, but because their family income is so high, they don't get a large package or anything they're interested in, and then they stop applying. But those people aren't really the people we're interested in for these statistics about low income.
Well, but there are people who are in need of money because their family income may be high, but they may not be getting anything from it.
That's true.
All right, coming around the table on this side, I'm looking at the Regents. Regent Vasquez.
Just for my own clarification, in reading the report, what exactly will be happening? Because is this where we as a board, based on some recommendation, are going to say, number one is the one we're going for, number two, I wasn't quite clear. And then especially as I was reading the report on the second page, towards the end of that page where it says the group recommends that the Board of Regents seek a statutory change to provide the board with the responsibility, and it goes on and on. So could you just clarify for me, will we be presented, what are we as a board going to be presented with, or, because it sounds like all of these we could apply at any one time or at no time. So I'm just trying to better understand where are we going with this.
Well, I think we are where we are, and that's, I think the discussion today was intended to react to what you see in front of you, which is, you say, Jose, a number of options which could be used individually or in combination with others, might be done on some campuses and not on others. And again, I think what the previous presenters tried to say was that we've already begun to do some things on some campuses that we're not doing on others. And we hope to get out of this some sense from the board of which of these options you thought were viable, which you'd like to consider for further consideration. Based on the discussion today, I would intend to come back with some recommendations, the discussion today, and then further consideration of, an analysis of what's in this report, with some recommendations at the April meeting about what we might do going forward. There will be a decision that will be made at the June meeting on tuition for next year that this discussion and anything I would have to say next month, I hope, would inform. So I think you may be looking for a clarity that we intended explicitly not to have now. That is, we wanted to look at the pros and cons of each of these and then see which of them we might want to use as tools going forward, again, to best meet the needs of the growth agenda.
And I guess in light of that, as I was again reading this, it almost struck me that as a region, it seemed like clearly it would not be a situation where we would say we are committed to tuition stratification, that's our number one A and nothing else, but that rather we would be using all of these. Would it be more appropriate for us to be looking for, from your office, Kevin, kind of like what is the criteria that we would use to be able to say, in this instance, this is the one to use versus this one? And so maybe that would be more of a, and maybe I'm trying to make it too simplistic, that here's a little checklist that says when these things appear, tuition stratification is your best tool. When these other things appear, differentiation, tuition may be the more appropriate one. Is that something, I guess for me, that would be something that would be rather helpful.
I think some of those kinds of criteria, as you call them, are implicit in some of the pros and cons and considerations that you see in the report now. And I hope through the course of this discussion and then further reflection to make some of that, as you're suggesting, into more explicit criteria in regarding how we think about these things. And, one big divide as we think about tuition and financial aid policy is, do we say, well, we've got to do everything the same across every campus, or is it okay not to have a plateau on some campuses and have a plateau on others? Now, as a matter of fact, again, that's the situation we have right now because one campus does not use the plateau, stout. so that there is that, as usual in a system, that divide between this, does everybody have to do everything pretty much the same, or can we as a board allow for flexibility in tuition? And again, what are the pros and cons of generally of flexibility? What are the pros and cons of having everything the same, at least in the sectors across the system?
Jose, I would like to just offer from the standpoint of a fellow regent that answer to that first question you asked. I think the feeling among the regents has been, we come to a meeting where we're going to deal with tuition, and we have an hour and a half, and it's costs have gone up, state support's gone down, we have to raise tuition. What's the level you can tolerate until you get sick? And then we have to vote. And I think the regents are, this is such a big issue, and the tuition and financial aid have to be in that same discussion. So let's sit back, not at a June meeting or something like that where we have to make a decision on tuition for the coming year. And let's get all the options out there, the feeling of there's got to be a better way to tackle this problem. So let's look at all the options.
And I guess if I could just make the final one. To me, the one that I was also very intrigued with was that statement that I just finished reading about what are the potential statutory changes or other changes that we as a board would need to be seeking. That to me would be a rather interesting discussion, and I'm not sure, and again maybe Kevin, because I read it rather fast, maybe those things were already implicit or here that I just didn't read them the first time around and said, oh, here's one that for the upcoming legislative session we should be thinking about, or was that part of the recommendation that you would be bringing forth to us to say, here's kind of the statutory change agenda that we're proposing.
Yes, I'd anticipate if we have some changes that we do want to suggest, that I'd come forward with those at the April meeting.
Thank you.
Okay, looking down. Regent Falbo was a member of the Tuition and Financial Aid Work Group.
Thank you. One thing I did want to point out is you might be interested in going back and looking at Appendix E, where we did try to bridge the gap on funding. And that was one of the recommendations. That was the first recommendation unanimously approved by the committee. Another thing, to answer Jose a little more, our charge was to come up with options, not a proposal. And then what those options meant, if they required legislative changes or if they did not, and then to go back and filter through those and hopefully do whatever we feel is the appropriate thing to do and the right thing to do. Another thing, and I don't see it in here, but we did have some charts, and I thought it'd be of interest to all of you. And I'm not going to remember the numbers. Frida will. The inflation-adjusted cost of an education. Do you have those numbers? They're very interesting over the course of this same time frame that you see these other charts, which goes back to the 70s. That we look at dollar amounts and we get sticker shock. And if you actually look at inflation-adjusted numbers, it's a much different picture. And I think you need to have that in front of you so that it tempers that sticker shock.
The tuition support and the GPR support over time, adjusted for inflation, are in your report on pages 36 and 37. I'm thinking about the inflation-adjusted price of tuition.
Cost of education.
Yeah.
I think we had some charts on the inflation-adjusted cost of education.
And I don't have that with me right now, but we can that.
Yeah, I think that'd be important to the whole group.
Anything else, Regent Falbo?
No.
Okay. Any other regents on this side? Regent Colin-Keys.
When you talked about debt and average $20,000, which is bad enough, that probably does not include any of the credit card debt.
Does not.
Which we heard about before, which is huge. So
some big numbers. The cohort tuition, if you use that model and somebody came in, does differential then play a part if in your sophomore year the students decide to vote in a differential tuition for some program? Or is it, no, this is the tuition, this is what you're going to pay for 4 years and that's it, and we aren't going to add any backdoor fees?
Backdoors, quit.
What?
Backdoor me now.
Okay, well, whatever. I'm Tom. Sorry.
The Tuition and Financial Aid Working Group did have that discussion whether with implementation of any different type of a method of charging tuition, the current differentials that we have would go away. The discussion from at least the campus perspective was that those differentials are in place to do certain things, and they have staffing and associated expenses related to those that they would want to maintain at those institutions. It might change the number of proposals that you would get for additional differentials, but they would see this as something in addition to what is currently already being offered. So there would be, you set a base rate, and then the differentials we have in place would probably go on top of those.
Could I just drop in a question, and we'll come to Regent Crane, that I think, and again, I'm asking this openly, I think it's one we ought to put on the table and get some initial reaction from the board to. You know, the way we, and this is a good thing in face value, the way we have talked about debt connected with an education is it's a bad thing. You shouldn't have any debt. The ideal is to not have any debt when you graduate. I agree, that's the ideal. Given the situation we find ourselves in terms of state support, the relatively shrinking proportion of it, higher charge to tuition. And given the fact that, you know, most of us, I think, expect when we make a major purchase, a house, a car, a boat, a snowmobile, we may need to take a loan to do that. And many of those are loans on depreciating assets. As soon as you drive that car off the lot, the value of it starts to go down. You know, what we're talking about, we all know in terms of a higher education, is a vastly appreciating asset. We know how much more money people make over the course of a working lifetime, close to $1 million, we think now, from having a high school diploma to having a baccalaureate degree. How does all that affect, or should it at all, our thinking about student loans? Regent Davis.
On who you're talking about. For a low-income person, you know, when I look at a Milwaukee statistic of 19% baccalaureate degree holders, and if I layer on top of that, well, okay, we're going to put a full court press to getting you to go to college in various ways and all of that. But by the way, you're going to have to plan on taking on $21,000 of debt, blah, blah, blah. I just think I'm arguing against myself.
Yeah, talk about a sticker shock.
For a low-income person to say, oh, no problem. I got a boat, I got a house, I got a, you know, I mean, it just, but on the other hand, for an upper middle class, higher two quintiles, you know, it might be a different answer. That's just my reaction.
I think it also depends on the career they choose. You know, social workers are only going to make so much money a year. An engineer, $21,000 in debt, or an attorney, or a teacher, God knows.
God knows if you
God knows that, you know,
you'll get out of debt.
Heavy in
But
debt, heavy.
Some of those careers that, you know, people have a passion for and want to do are going to be paying $40,000 a year. So $21,000 in debt when you're making $40,000 is painful for them.
Regent Crane.
I'm going to build off that and then make some other remarks, because what Eileen has just said is one of the things that bothers me about our continually making our arguments for what we all know is important purely on the basis of how much money people are going to make. And while that is relevant, and while that is relevant to the entire society, it is not relevant in particular in terms of the differences among many of the professions that we want people to be a part of. And it just seems very important to me that we emphasize that we want people educated to do something other than make money. And obviously we want that too, but that's part of the issue for me.
And in a way what you're raising is the issue of, and this really isn't addressed much in the report, is there some sense that, in some parts, it's been talked about in other states, you ought to charge tuition according to the discipline, according to the major. You approved a business program differential at UW-Madison. We're already doing it. You're already doing it.
That is what happened. But then let me say my other remark before it goes all directions. I just want to say that it was a great privilege for me to be a member of this of the group, and I learned a tremendous amount. And this is a very complicated topic on both sides, both on the tuition side as well as the financial aid side. And I want to express a lot of respect for the professionals in our system and on our campuses who work in these areas, because not only are they they know everything about how this plays out, but they also have the right priorities. And I felt very strongly about that, and very glad to have that opportunity. And like Danae, I share the alarm about about the issues in front of us. My first meeting as a regent was to vote on tuition. That isn't the most. That's not the best meeting of the year in terms of how it feels. And while I have had a lot of sympathy for the students that I have heard, and each one of them has been genuine, and I know that that is duplicated and replicated over and over and over in, as you say, kitchen tables all over the state. I also am terribly concerned about the quality of the education that we are able to offer, because that is greatly affected by the reduction in state support, and then the pressure that it puts on us to not only make it affordable, but to be able to deliver what students deserve in order to do what we want to. So I just wanted to say that this filled out that experience for me, the things I already felt in many ways. One of the comments I also want to make is that I said this is complicated, and I think just the average student or parent, do they understand what differential tuition is, or what the composite is of their bill? So we have the issue of making it not understood to students and families, but also to the state at large. I think that the individual parts of this are, and how they interact, is something that we have a lot of communication work to do with the legislature, probably, and with the state of Wisconsin. And then just one final comment. One of the things that did become clear to me and was different from where I started out, was I am convinced we have to have a lot more flexibility in what we're doing, and from campus to campus and situation to situation. I do believe we need to be doing some innovative things and provide for individual campus situations in ways that I was not ready to entertain before, and I am now.
Regent Smith.
Comment and a question, maybe for you, Kevin, or the committee. And I've seen some emails on it the last couple of days, both from students and even among the regents at times, on this idea of the use of differential tuition or stratification for financial aid, which I think differential tuition and stratification and the flexibility that provides is an excellent tool. We saw, not only with the lacrosse example, but perhaps with some other discussion here about whether the money gained from stratification, charging a higher tuition and/or tuition differential, could be used for financial aid. And there's a political side of it. There's even, I got emails from students on this. And I'm just wondering, given our experience, and I know you and I talked about a little bit, what can you kind of let us in on your thinking on that?
Well, I'm still honestly thinking about it. I mean, personally, I haven't made up my own mind. A couple thoughts, and I'll ask maybe Frida or others to react, because they've thought more about it probably than I have, Debbie. What occurs to me is this board already approved one instance like that at your home campus in La Crosse, and that was a differential tuition brought forward by the chancellor after lots of consultation with the students, and in matter of fact, the student government supported it, as you recall, is
Right.
they need to for any differential tuition. So one of the fascinating things about these big policy discussions is they often take the frame of, oh, should we ever consider doing this? And then we look, and somewhere in the system we say, well, you know what, we're already doing this. Should we consider per credit tuition? Well, we're already doing this instead, you know. So we have these kind of pilot experiments going on. And I guess going back to Regent Crane's last point, I think the F word here, flexibility, is a really important one. And I think in that...
You don't want to be... You don't want to be quoted that way.
We're using that. Yep, in the environment we find ourselves in, changing as rapidly as it is in terms of the proportions of our support from various revenue streams and the greater number of revenue streams that we have supporting ourselves, I think maximum flexibility for us to react always with the base notion, with two base notions in mind. Number one, we want to hold down as much as we possibly can the tuition and fee costs, and we want to keep up as much as we possibly can the quality of what we're doing. So that's kind of the 30,000-foot answer, but let me turn to Frida or Debbie to see if they want to elaborate on that, or Don for that matter, or Sharon.
Well, my question also, Kevin, was, you know, the original idea with the lacrosse plan was by stratification to use some of that additional money for financial aid. Now, that ran into some problems in the legislature and has had kind of a mixed reaction to it.
Right.
And as I'm reading the report, I'm not clear, maybe you can, and the same, I think there's been ideas of time for differential tuition should be used for financial aid. And as we look for ways to increase financial aid, is that a realistic way to look, or does that run into too many political and other problems?
Well, it is part of the business school here.
Right. But the reason we've got legislation in front of right now in the state of Wisconsin in front of some...
You take that to be very straightforward.
Thank you, Chancellor Guy.
We did in healthcare. We essentially pay people, I think, money to help different.
It's called a hidden
Chancellor Shepherd. Bruce, why don't you grab the mic so folks can hear you?
Just two quick thoughts on the issue of per credit tuition. It was brought out there. It really simplifies back of the house operations to have per credit tuition. And as we get into these extensive partnerships that are unimaginably complex and multi-institutional, in our discussions this morning, you can see that's the future for all of us to do more and more and more of that. We certainly want to follow Stout's piloting of per credit tuition at Green Bay and hope that with the flexibility word, the F word, that opportunity is there for us. On the financial aid tuition issue, the one other thought is that we hear all this need to keep tuition down to provide access, but when you think about it, the sad fact is that 80% of our students come from the top 3 income quintiles. So what that means is that for every $5 we forego, 4 going into the pockets of middle and upper income families. If we really do want to meet, and we should meet the need for access, then we've got to, if we provide financial aid, 5 out of $5 are going targeted at those folks. That does create the perception we may be using tuition for redistribution of the lacrosse issue, but that's the way effectively to get the most bang for our bucks.
Chancellor Keating.
This is a complex issue, and especially as I hear people talking about the nimbleness that we need in the system and the flexibility, for instance, by campus tuition raise. All of us need money to run our campuses, and if you do not raise your tuition, obviously you're going to be a quality at risk because you're going to have less money to run your campus. And so if you do go toward campus by campus tuition, I would contend that we need something like financial aid by campus because it's no cheaper to give a credit at Parkside as it is to give a credit at Madison or Green Bay. In fact, it's more expensive because Parkside has a smaller population and therefore the distribution is not as well done. So if you go by campus, it's going to de facto, I think, have a quality implication, that those that are charging more get a better campus because they have more quality going into their education. Those that are charging less will have a less good campus because they simply cannot afford the quality that other campuses are affording. So this is a very tender question. And on my campus, for instance, the average income is not $120,000 or $140,000 per person. In fact, 40% of our student body are in the lowest 2 quintiles of income in the state. So we will argue, obviously, against big increases, and at the same time know it's cutting our own throat as far as providing the types of things we should do in education. If we could have some kind of a fluid hydraulic system of how money goes in the system, that might be the accommodation. But it's not as simple, okay, let's set differential tuition and sock it to the rich, and what the consequences are is let the poor suffer. So I think you have to really consider this very, very carefully because it is a complex issue.
Chancellor Santiago.
Just wanted to make 2 points on 2 separate issues. One is on the plateau. I support Chancellor Shepard's view of the plateau. As an economist, when you look at a policy issue, you really focus on 2 things, efficiency and equity. On efficiency grounds, it's bad policy. It leads us to overproduce credits that remain unused. And on equity grounds, it's a bad policy because it has part-time students subsidizing full-time students. And on our campus, the percentage of part-time students is going down. So it's getting even more inequitable. There's another point, slightly different, on a subject that is really about GPR, tuition, and enrollment. And if you look at from 02 to 07, and you look at the various campuses, you look at the relationship, either in terms of levels of tuition or growth in tuition, or levels or growth of GPR, or levels of growth of enrollment, you'll find very little correspondence between the 3, with perhaps the exception that GPR and tuition are inversely related. But if you look at the campuses, and my concern is that as we try to enact this growth agenda, you want to make sure you have an incentive structure that supports that. And on a I mean, what we deal with is the price per credit, that's tuition per credit. And the signals in terms of growth of enrollment and the revenue that comes from that tuition is not very direct. In fact, it's very indirect. And the signals are all wrong. If I could have stopped the enrollment growth that's occurred on our campus over the last 6 years, which is 72% of the system enrollment growth, without changing selectivity, I would have done it. Because the truth is, financially, it was not the way the university should have gone. That's the hand we were dealt. But I think as we look to grow enrollment, we've got to make sure that we align GPR, tuition, and enrollment growth. I think we're going to be successful at the end of the day.
Thanks. And let me go to Chancellor Joe Gow in a minute. Just let me comment on one thing Chancellor Santiago said. I think one of the issues he raises, really, in my mind, and I think we ought to have a conversation about this, is should we go back into a more formalized enrollment planning process, which we used to have in the system, where there were targets, and if you went over the target by a certain amount, you got to keep some of the money. If you went over the target by more than an amount, you got to keep less of the money, had to give more of it back. We kind of took the lid off of that a couple of years ago to encourage growth. But of course, one of the things that happens then is if you have successful growth, is you start to drive down the per student subsidy, as we have done at the UW-Milwaukee campus. Is that good or not? And if it's not, what's the consequence of it? I think we need to at least think of a more formal enrollment planning process once again and see where that takes us. Chancellor Gow.
You mentioned our experiment frequently, and I do need to thank you for the record of letting us do that, because it's rather extraordinary. And I know that, having worked in Minnesota in the system where they would never let one campus do something that was a little bit different from the other. So I think that's a wonderful thing, and I hope you feel that way too. We learned a lot of things, but we're still learning in this process. And one of the ones that really surprised me was I came in and said, I think this is a great plan, and I really like the financial aid component of it. And I thought, well, everybody believes that people who are better off should pay a bigger share than people who are less off. And I often say to people, my wife and I don't have kids, 2 cats, but we don't have kids. If we did, and they went to UWL, I would be happy to have them pay more than some of the single parents who I know go to our institution. And I would feel that is the right thing to do. But that idea, politically, was not very attractive. And what I learned was people in the legislature are highly interested in the middle income group. And I think it has something to do with voting behavior. So it's not a, that was an insightful line, wasn't it? But
this guy, he's got it.
And so we modified our approach and we said, okay, we'll take the GPR and we'll use that for aid, so it's not coming directly from the students. And actually, that, which I would have thought would be, wow, who wouldn't want to stand up and say, let's give more aid to students from all around the state, by the way. It's not just a UWL issue, it's a statewide issue, who come to our institution. And yet, that has not been done yet. I'm hoping it will be, but it's hit some snags. And that underscores how we all work in a political context. And I think, personally, as long as our funding is involved with politics, it will never be straightforward. And actually, I make an observation, again, nothing too profound, but if you have a hospital, a university, and a prison, only one of those institutions is a place people are excited about going there. And so when you have so when scarce resources must be divided, it's only natural that they'll say, well, you know, there's those other 2 places, boy, they can't charge tuition. And so I think there's kind of an inevitability about this, and that's unfortunate, particularly when you take the longer view and you think the way it used to be. But I think Kevin has made a good point. You know, people make investments and they take out loans to do that, and I'm sure Mike has no problem with that, and and they pay them back and they get a good return on their investment. Matter of fact, we've probably been too good at pointing out to people this $1 million more over their career if they have a college degree, because then the public starts to say, well, hey, wait a minute, it's not really a public good, it's a private benefit, and you ought to pay for that yourself. The other point I'll make, and this was very important in our experience, when you want to raise tuition, you need to be able to explain why. And we haven't talked at all about why do we need more resources. And for us at La Crosse, it was a 24-to-1 student-faculty ratio, one of the highest in the nation for our kind of university. We just need more staff. And people get that. If you say, we're going to hire more teachers and advisors to work with students, and we're going to ask the students to pay a little more, I think, again, they're not going to strike up the band and say, yay, this is great, but they do understand. And our experience has been, we sent out a newsletter to all the accepted students for next year, and I wrote a letter and explained why we were raising their tuition by $500. I have not heard anything back. Now, maybe they didn't read it. I don't know. But I think the students and the parents are pretty good about reading those things. And so, you know, we feel that this is the right thing to do. I'll conclude by quoting von Bismarck said, politics is the art of the possible, of course. And John Kenneth Galbraith modified that, and he said, no, politics is the art of distinguishing between what is disastrous and what is merely unpalatable. And I think in the case of what we're talking about, I think raising tuition is unpalatable, but I think compromising on quality is disastrous. So that's been my experience over the past year.
All right, and I want to go back to Regent Spector and then Regent Rosenzweig. Let me just make one more comment in reaction to Regent Smith's question, and I'll get to Mike. You were raising the question of the relationship between tuition and financial aid, how they relate. I think we started to see something happen in this state and in the country that we haven't seen happen before in relation to need-based financial aid, and that's people stepping up and institutions stepping up to cover increases in tuition. In our own state, that happened with the gift from the mortgages and the gift from the Great Lakes Higher Education Assistance Corporation. And just this Monday, the Faculty Senate at UW-Madison voted to do a fundraising campaign of voluntary dollars going toward need-based financial aid. Now this, and you've all seen the reports of some of the Ivy League institutions, you know, the very, very top of the pyramid, if you want to think of them that way, a few of them saying, well, we're going to cover tuition fees for families who make less than $60,000, less than $100,000. These are kind of new developments, and I think one of the fears we have on both of those, using differential tuition to cover need-based financial aid, using more and more private money to cover need-based financial aid, is will the state continue to keep its commitment if we do that? And I think we ought to think some about more privately funded need-based tuition aid in this state. Again, we've already got $215 million to do that in private money now from Great Lakes and from the mortgages. But I think as we think about that, we're going to have to think very carefully to keep it tied some way to the state complement to that. But that's a whole different and longer conversation. But there's something going on here that wasn't going on before in this regard, regarding the relationship between tuition, need-based financial aid, and private giving. Regent Spector. Okay.
Well, I think my point would have been well addressed by Chancellor Gao and you kind of, President Riley, elaborating on it. I would just say that I am very, very supportive of flexibility, and we have seen several models that have come before the business committee since I've been sitting on it that have been very exciting. Obviously, Platteville and UW La Crosse are good examples of those models that are kind of interesting, and they portray different models of or pilots, if you will. I guess I go back, though, to a conversation I had when I just came on the board, and Jesus was on the board with us, and I think Danae, and some of us had the discussion about financial aid and what the legislature had to understand about our needs. And I have some fears as we're talking about these various different models, that we lessen our ability to make the case that the needs of the student population in our state are going to be deprived of a whole population of people, potentially, if we freeze people out of that place in higher education. I mean, we just do. And so I think as we go, and I'd love to see that legislative list of changes that we're looking at to take, and to be able to build in perhaps greater flexibility for different institutions. But as we do look at that, I think you have to also balance it with what is it going to send in the way of a signal that responsibility is, in fact, across the board throughout the state for this very, very important topic. And so that would be just a caution.
Regent Spector and then Chancellor Burnell.
I would add to what the last two said just a little differently. I think you should take the risk that this would undermine you with the legislature, because I don't think the legislature is going to change. I think at best we'll have the GPR that we have now, and more likely less, because I think it's a demographic question. As more and more people have fewer and fewer children, as more and more people want Medicaid over education, I think the reality, just like at the K-12 level, is that there isn't going to be as much public money for education, in part because it's viewed as an individual thing, in part for all these other reasons. And I think a part of this report, or part of these options, because I support these things as very tactically sound that we should do, would be the bigger question you raised. As you look ahead 5 years or 8 years, what percentage are we going to need from private philanthropy? And I think it's going to be, the mortgage thing is the example of what's coming. And Harvard and Yale and Princeton with their endowments have done it. We need to do that even as a public university. And you need to come up with ideas, whether it's the expansion of the foundation, whether it's ideas I'm not smart enough to think about, as to what we should be doing, what we should be investing in to raise that kind of money in the future, because otherwise I think we're going to be putting in the same speeches that people have been making and getting the same results unless there's something about the future, irrespective of who the president is or anything else. The demographics in our state is not going to grow as fast as these other states. We won't have the same resources as California and Texas and North Carolina and Florida over time. I think we have to look to alternative sources of support which are not inconsistent with what we're doing at all, but supplement it, but do it in a professional, directed manner.
Chancellor Brunel.
As we have this discussion about access and quality, I want to remind you that it's easy to put a face on access. It's not easy to put a face on quality. But let me put a face on quality for you. It's the quality of the faculty member in the classroom. And if you don't know, I want you to know how rapidly eroding our ability is to recruit and retain top faculty. When I look at these lines and I see what's happened here, I know that if it weren't for a lot of people who've been with us for 25 or 30 years, going the extra mile, we've been able to maintain quality in the face of declining state resources. That window is beginning to close. We have searches on our campus where we have 5 applicants. I've searched for, Libby, a reading teacher for 3 years. I've had a person teaching reading in a first-class school of education who was a temporary year to year because we couldn't afford to attract the kinds of professional reading professors that teach in most universities. Is there anything more critical than being able to teach a child to read and having had a faculty member who was top-notch here? So I really, as we think about tuition, we can put anybody in the classroom. We can have them teach 6 courses. But what's going to be the quality that comes out at the end of the line? Thank you.
Regent Vasquez and then Chuck. Yes.
I'd like to go back several steps to some of the earlier discussion about the amount of loans and also talk about, again, that political strategy or how do you get other things. And I'm focused more on the financial aid and maybe not as much on
the GPR. But I think that we also need to remember that there are thousands of other individuals getting baccalaureate education that are not going to public institutions, and they are also amassing a tremendous amount of debt. And I wonder if there can be something gained by partnering with the private institutions and even with the technical colleges and developing a strategy that way that those that are in the position of authority or power to change financial aid are hearing from more than one voice, which just hearing from the UW system may not be enough because we may be perceived as having too many other political agendas. But if they are approached by others that are also talking about how intolerable it is that their students are also amassing tremendous debt, that might make a little bit of an impact, more so than just us going to the table and pounding the desks and saying how our students are doing that.
when in reality it's not only our students, it's all the other private colleges and university students that are doing that. So I think we need to forget that the world just doesn't revolve around us, as important as we are, and I think we are important, but there are others that are also finding themselves having probably this kind of discussion and trying to figure out how they can do for their students as we're talking about trying to do for our students.
Jim Pruitt.
I just wanted to compliment, as always, the chancellors for their comments. As they are, as they seem to do every meeting, make some outstanding points. One of the things that struck me, though, as in fact as Chancellor Keating was speaking, was I think one of the sensitivities it seems to me we need to have as a board, when we look at these when we are flexible and we look at individual decisions and individual initiatives, is realize that there can be some unintended consequences of those decisions going forward. And, particularly on the question of tuition stratification, I must confess, I have a lot of nervousness and concern about it as we go along the road. That's not to say that we shouldn't do it. I certainly support it. The lacrosse initiative, I think, as the Chancellor articulated, it's an experiment. We ought to see how it does and how it goes, both as it plays through the system and on the campuses. And I think that's the only other sort of pitch I wanted to make, was that with flexibility, it seems, also comes accountability. And we have, I think, entrusted this wonderful group of entrepreneurial chancellors who have come forward with great individual initiatives related to differential tuition and tuition stratification. And I think those were all the right decisions to make. I do think we have a responsibility to monitor those decisions and to have a regular and periodic review of those decisions to see how they're doing. Non-resident tuition, Don mentioned, was a decision that was, as many of you on this board know, relatively controversial. And I think we now have an opportunity to see how it's working. And I think in all these cases, some level of sort of accountability mechanisms being built in to review these kinds of individual decisions is important. And I know, that's not a unique opinion. I know everybody shares it.
As a matter of fact, there's some suggestion of that in the report
It
itself.
ought to be one of the reasons for the flexibility, the accountability.
All right. Regent Davis.
I, too, I'm always thrilled when I hear the chancellors participate in our learning and really thinking deeply about major policy options that are in front of us, and I think that speaks well to our relationship. So I want to say that. I also want to say that the quality, I like hearing the words access and quality, because if I think back on the last tuition issue we had, one of the things that we benefited from was the fact that we stayed on the same page with the students, and we didn't divide over as if one or the other, one versus the other. And I think we have to maintain that going forward. I don't think a conversation that talks about concerns around access need necessarily mean that we're unmindful of the need to ensure quality of the educational experience. And I'm not saying anybody said that. I just want to make sure we continue to couple the two, as opposed to fall prey to sounding like to go down to one path is going to be at the expense of other. Obviously, you want to consider the ramifications. So I just want to make that caution and then ask this question of you, Kevin, which is related. And I asked you this on the telephone, actually, I'm pretty sure. The student voice going forward. I do recognize that there were 2 students on the committee. Excuse me. And I do recognize that at the campus level, as the report indicates, there is significant student input in decisions around obviously, around differential as an example, but for the most part, I think very healthy relationships on each of the campuses, from what I can glean, on decisions that affect them, like how much it costs to go to school and what you're paying for. But I am concerned because I have sensed a change. I won't say an erosion, I'll just say a change in the input from leadership, from representative of the student voice to us. And so in a go-forward process, I'm just wondering your thoughts on how you're going to ensure that in a real way, and when I mean by real, authentic, sincere way, the student voice, because these are really meaty issues, and I just don't know what your thoughts are on how do you ensure that the student voice is present throughout the process as we go forward. in your process especially.
Sure. A couple of things, and then maybe Senior Vice President Martin would want to comment, or two student regents would want to comment. But the student government leaders participated in, as you said, the development of this report, and then they had the full report just about the same time you did, and we've had ongoing conversations with them about it. We've gotten a resolution or two just recently from several of the campuses, and we tried to sequence this from the February meeting to this meeting to the April meeting so that it works. And what I'm saying is, at the April meeting, we will be inviting student leadership to come in and talk directly to the board. United Council campuses and the 5 that are not part of United Council. So I think, well, it used to be 6. I think maybe 1 went back in. But at least when I checked last night, that was the case. But at any rate, there's a mix of voices, and we want to have them to be able to talk directly to you about this issue, and more broadly about the development of the budget and their budget priorities for 07-09, because, again, believe it or not, that's coming at us pretty rapidly. So we want to get their voices in early into the mix, so you hear them and then can factor them in right from the get-go. But certainly, I'm sure the regents or the chancellors will have some things they want to say, based partly on the report, but based partly on hearing our discussion today of this tuition and financial aid report at the April meeting. Yes, Regent Thomas.
Thank you. There's been a number of students who have voiced input on this document. Perhaps you've seen them via email. There was a letter drafted that represented several different student governments, and just the summary briefly is that students remain concerned about the level of tuition, about the cost of tuition, and about affordability. But I think there was a statement there that we're also looking towards greater financial aid, because there's a realization that tuition is going to be a big part of the next budget, or a big conversation that we have in the near future. There was also a statement that students from these several different campuses are generally supportive of ideas of going forward on differential tuition, particularly because there can be a strong student input in where the dollars go. I've been talking to a lot of different people, students, but especially professors on different campuses, and just to share some ideas that I've gathered here at Madison, I'm in the political science department, and in the last 2 or 3 years, including the losses we expect this year, we will have lost 14 of 40 faculty. Now, in a department that serves the largest undergraduate population in the College of Letters and Science, that's a huge, huge cut. I can tell when I go onto the timetable that I can take less, I have offerings available for less undergraduate seminars, less courses taught directly by the professor and not to a gigantic, lecture hall. There are fewer honors sections available that are taught by professors, and there's a further distancing of the ideas we're being presented and the conversations we're having about them. There's a distancing of students and the professionals who are sharing those ideas. And that's really damaging to the quality of education we're getting. And it's happening across the board. It's happening at Whitewater. It's happening at, who else? I was talking to some people yesterday at the Posters event who are also experiencing the same thing. But then there's this other conversation about what I call soft compensation, ways we can retain faculty that don't depend on, the multi-digit or, multi-thousands of dollars more that other schools are offering them. There was a professor in the political science department who's making about $90,000 right now and was just offered a position for $120,000 somewhere else. And this professor I was talking to, this was his friend, he said, that person would have stayed here if they were making $95,000 a year. They just need a statement that we value them and we want them to be on our campuses. If they had had a little bit more of a travel budget, if they had had a seminar class that they could have taken or a lighter load, they weren't doing. They were being able to do more research, that would have kept them here. And those benefits, I would argue, those fringe benefits don't cost us very much, but not giving them is costing us tremendously. And we can't hire the quality of people that we're losing for the price that we're paying them when they leave. It's just not possible. So I've gotten really frustrated with this in the past few weeks, and I think that this conversation needs to happen quickly, and we need to act on it, because these departments on every campus are losing people, and this is like the critical stage, because the tenured faculty who maintain the culture of the department are leaving, and we're not able to maintain that culture.
Regent Conley-Kiesler.
I just want to make a comment to what Mike said about philanthropy has to play a much bigger role in what happens in this system, much like the Harvard and the Yales. The reason they can do that is because they have billion-dollar endowments sitting there. It's very easy for them to spin off. But when Jose said, maybe we should do this together, we actually did this in Oshkosh with 7 of the bigger foundations. There's that instinct when you say, let's market together, is like, no way, because what if the hospital gets money and I don't get the money? But you get past that, and you can do pieces where you jointly market the need, and then you individually do your pieces also. But it's creating that awareness that we have to rely now on some philanthropic dollars. I mean, the chancellors never 20 years ago had to raise dollars like you do today for all of your capital. It just was, you did program. You did what you had to do around your universities, not out there being a professional fundraiser. So that has changed drastically. And I'm hoping that committee, one of the committees that you're, Don, that you're working on is going to talk about that philanthropy and how we get that word out there, how we raise scholarships. If we know who's doing those big scholarships, and we know all this money is leaving the state and it's going to Minnesota and Illinois and everywhere else because the kids are choosing to go there, great. Send your scholarship there, but create one for this system. It's okay, but create one. And Joe, when you were talking before and you said, I would pay an extra $1,000 to help some child if my child was going to school. I leaned over to Judy and said, yeah, if I got the tax deduction for that, I would do that in a heartbeat too. So I think there's things we can do to encourage this philanthropy. We just have to sit down and figure it out, and give donors a venue and a menu of options, because honestly, there is money in this state, and people like to give, but you just have to give them options of things they might want to give to, not what we want. We all want unrestricted dollars. That's what we want. But unfortunately, the boomers are control freaks, and they are not going to give you unrestricted dollars.
That's the difference,
That's
Mike.
the difference. So instead, let's give them some options. Even in the K-12 in Oshkosh, we're looking at creating donors choose on all the websites for the schools, because some people might want to give $100, some people might want to give $500, and some people can afford to give $10,000. Let's give them and make them all feel part of it, if it's $100 or $10,000. And that's something we have to spend some time on, like the privates have done for many years.
Agreed. Well, President Bradley is giving me the high sign to wrap this session up. So let me say, I don't know how you feel, but certainly on both of these issues, I think these have been terrific conversations. We'll take both of these issues, the role of the UW colleges, tuition and financial aid policy, now back to the chancellors and the provosts for more conversations between now and the April meeting. If any of you have further thoughts that these conversations today provoke as we go along, give me a call, drop me a line, and we'll work those in. I hope you feel as I do that the intent of this first of our one-day sort of seminar-like meetings was really very well met, thanks to the great participation by many, many of you in the room. So I thank you all for that, and I'll turn it back over to President Bradley.
Good. Thanks, President Riley. We have some items to go through to finish up our official business. I do not have a report other than to give you a half hour of thoughts on UW colleges and financial aid. You got the report of the February 26th meeting of the Wisconsin Technical College System Board in your folders. Are there any questions or comments on that? Okay. President Riley, do you have a report of the system president?
I do, an abbreviated one in recognition of our new kind of meeting here, but just let me mention a couple things. timely, I think. Last week, there was a rollout of the Adult Student Initiative on the UW Fox Valley campus. Regent Crane joined us for that. Chancellor Wilson and the governor and Provost Lampe and Provost Shepard of Extension and Colleges and Extension. It was about what we intend to do with and for adult students across the state, those we have in the system now, but those we hope to attract. Remember, that's one of the twin pillars of the growth agenda, broader, deeper cut of traditional age students and a better job with the adult students. There's a brochure in your red packet. It's a new brochure on the Adult Student Initiative, the Adult Student Guide. It's got some cross-outs on the cover. Do not try to erase them. They're part of the message, as you'll see if you've had a chance to look at it. And it's a very good piece. And I think that event helped to showcase, as a complement to the covenant and all the attention we've gotten with that and the gifts on the traditional age students, about how important the adult students are and are stepping up to meet that need. Secondly, some good news on that on the Making Opportunity Affordable grant program sponsored by the Lumina Foundation. You may remember that we mentioned we were submitting a proposal in December for that grant program, and I've got some news. We partnered with DPI in the schools and with the technical college system in the proposal, with some help from the governor's office and from the Wisconsin Association of Independent Colleges and Universities. This Lumina Foundation, Making Opportunity Affordable, connects directly to the growth agenda, directly to the conversation we just had. Therefore, the four challenges that this grant program is aimed at, as Lumina has defined it, are: 1, increasing the percentage of college-educated adults across the country; 2, containing costs and strategically investing resources; 3, strengthening institutional and system capacity to serve larger and more diverse student populations; and 4, improving student learning. The news is this, that we were called by Lumina and told that there were 42 states that had submitted proposals initially, and we were now among 11 that would get a site visit. And so that site visit will be happening, Rebecca, next week? 2 weeks from now. And the hope is that we will be among the states, which I think originally were talked about as 10, that would get a planning grant for $100,000 to do some planning between this September and August 2009 on how we would develop an action plan to implement after that. And the implementation grant would be awarded for up to 5 states. So we got from 42 to 11. 11 will go down eventually to 5. And I'm not sure exactly when Lumina will decide that, but the site visit is going to be part of that. And if you're one of the 5 states, you will get a grant renewable annually for $500,000 a year for up to 4 years to work on these issues of affordability and quality, with a national network that Lumina is establishing to do that. So I want to thank our colleagues and our partners, Libby and the technical colleges. I think our technical colleagues have left, but this is a good partnership, and we hope that we'll continue to go forward in the competition. So we'll keep you posted on that. We did have a great posters in the Rotunda session yesterday. A number of you were there, and we got some very good play on that. Erica Perez is still here. She wrote an article on the front page of the second section of the Milwaukee newspaper talking about the Rotunda showcases UW students' research. And for those of you who were not there, we had Dr. Nancy Hensel, who is the head of the National Council on Undergraduate Research, who spoke at a couple of the venues there. And I know from speaking to her that she was really very, very impressed with the work we were doing across the system to encourage undergraduate research. So it's really nice to hear from that prophet outside your land that you're doing the right thing and doing very well in comparisons nationally. So it was a good day overall down there at the legislature. Another beautiful day in the UW at the Capitol, as Chancellor Erlenbach would say about Superior. On my way back after lunch, Chancellor Gao slipped a note into my hand and asked me if I would note this to the board, so I'm going to do it. And that is that the 2007 graduates of the UW La Crosse Physician Assistant Program earned the highest scores in the country on their recent certification exam. There are 142 other physical assistant programs in the United States And UWL program, Joe noted, is offered in partnership with the Madison Lutheran Hospital and the Mayo Clinic, and now claims to be one of the best in the country. So that's And then it is St. Patrick's Day soon, President Bradley, and I thought in recognition of that I might read an Irish poem, but I decided I wouldn't. No, because we're doing things differently. It's a new kind of meeting schedule and scheme, so I Italians may not clap when you said we're not going to read an Irish poem. But I started to think about, well, one of the things that the Irish have been able to do with the English language consistently is subvert it and make it roll over, and they love the wordplay, and they love the double entendres, and they love the puns, and I was thinking about definitions of words, and I thought I'd read you a couple that I think you'll like that are kind of in the spirit of Irish wordplay. I actually got these way back when, I think, from Rebecca Karoff, who she's still here. She is. Now, this will show you what somebody who works on the Liberal Education and America's Promise Project really does with their time. So these are the definitions. Coffee, noun, a person who is coughed upon. Flabbergasted, adjective, appalled over how much weight you have gained. Abdicate, verb, to give up all hope of ever having a flat stomach. Esplanade, verb, to attempt an explanation while drunk. Negligent, adjective, describes a condition in which you absent-mindedly answered the door in your nightgown. Limp, verb, to walk with a lisp. Gargoyle, noun, an olive-flavored mouthwash. Flatulence, noun, the emergency vehicle that picks you up after you are run over by a steamroller. Balderdash, noun, a rapidly receding hairline. Rectitude, noun, the formal, dignified demeanor assumed by a proctologist immediately before he examines you. Oyster, noun, a person who sprinkles his conversation with Yiddish expressions. Pokemon, noun, a Jamaican proctologist. And finally, Frisbeetarianism, noun, the belief that when you die, your soul goes up on the roof and gets stuck there. So may all your souls come unstuck on St. Patrick's Day, and then 3 days later, the beginning of spring, on the 20th. So I hope that you float along joyously at the beginning of spring, and that a gentle breeze carries you wherever you want to go. Mr. President, I turn the podium back over to you.
Well, I'm sorry to have to do this to you, Jeff, but I now need to call on you to present the report of the Physical Planning and Funding Committee.
I will make it very brief. The Physical Planning and Funding Committee met this morning upstairs, the 19th floor, in a room that has a beautiful view of Lake Mendota. We welcomed new Regent Vasquez to the meeting, and I have to tell you that in recruiting him to this committee, I told him that we always meet in a beautiful room like that, and I did get him to sign up, so would you notarize his signature?
Lawyers again.
Yeah. We heard from Mr. Miller about the Building Commission meeting in February. They approved $69 million in projects. But two other items from that meeting are significant. One is that we had made a request last month for alternative delivery methods for 6 building projects that we had approved, and only 2 of them, those requests, were approved by the Building Commission. They were the UW-Madison South Campus Union Project and UW-Stout-Jarvis Science Wing remodeling. The alternative delivery systems that we're talking about is single prime contractor versus multiple prime contractor arrangements. And
We're simply trying to do business the way private sector does business. It makes a lot of sense, but unfortunately there are political implications there that we haven't been able to overcome. There is good news, however. The Commission did instruct the Department of Administration to work with interested parties, I presume including us, to recommend certain statutory changes that would improve the efficiency of the process, presumably to allow us on a regular basis to employ a single prime contractor delivery method. So Mr. Miller will be working on that. He also reported, and this is interesting, that at the February meeting, the governor presented the 2007 Design and Construction Awards, which recognize excellence in state building projects, and two of those are buildings that the Regents visited very recently. The governor's awards went to the workshop architects for the UW River Falls New Student Union, which you recall that we met in, very lovely facility. And also the award for excellence in architectural design was given to Plunkett Racich Architects for the microbial science building here in Madison, where we also were at dinner, you'll recall. The following resolutions were unanimously approved and are now presented as consent agenda items. They are in your materials. You can review them if you wish. Resolution 1.3.b is simply to authorize a swap of real estate here in Madison, at UW-Madison, between the Regents and Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation to expand the Wisconsin Institutes for Discovery over here on University Avenue. Basically, you may recall that the Regents have an agreement with WRF which transfers Regent-owned land which is in the 1300 block of University Avenue, to WRF in exchange for parcels to be purchased by WRF and transferred to the Regents in exchange. We haven't yet identified what those parcels are, but this proposal includes a 1/3 acre parcel in the 1200 block of University Avenue. This request will be used by WRF to create an animal research facility which will be used in conjunction with the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery, and specifically in connection with the Morgridge Institute. It is called a vivarium. This is a word that I hadn't heard before, but maybe there was a definition of it there. Maybe we can think of one. Anyway, the vivarium will be used for research and will connect with an underground tunnel across Orchard Street to the Wisconsin Institute. And there's no fiscal impact to that. The land that we are exchanging is appraised at approximately $2.7 million, and we will get $2.7 million or more in swapped real estate. Resolution 1.3.c is a request for approval of the design report and authority to increase the scope and budget and construct the UW Whitewater Residence Hall project. This is a project we have already approved and has gone through Department of Administration and the Building Commission, and was enumerated as part of the 2007-2009 capital budget. What we're doing is adding modifying the design report slightly and adding it slightly to the budget. This new residential hall, by the way, will replace two res halls that are being demolished which were to make way for an academic building. The project really is designed, this increase in the project designed to replace parking that will be lost by the creation of this residential hall, 165 parking spaces. And the budget increase is about $1.1 million, almost all of which will come from, I think all of which will come from program revenue, supported borrowing, and program revenue cash.
Finally, 1.3.D is the maintenance, repair, and remodeling projects. We have one of those just about every month. These projects, which are described in the materials, include installation of a waterproofing system at Camp Randall. The south end of the stadium leaks like a sieve, and they've tried a lot of fixes for that, but it hasn't been fixed yet. So that will be part of it. The remodeling of a facility space in UW Madison at the Memorial Union, and window and floor tile replacements at UW River Falls. I think that's, yes. Those are the three items. You don't read your materials, Mr. Regent Walsh.
The Chancellor's going to answer.
Chancellor Benson.
I'm right here, Joe.
All right, well, those three...
I'm on the committee.
Those three resolutions were passed unanimously by the committee, and I move their adoption as resolutions 1.3B, C, and D.
Is there a second to the motion?
Second.
Is there any request to remove any of the resolutions from the consent agenda? If not, all in favor of the motion say aye. Aye. All opposed? Motion carries.
Mr. President, the committee then adjourned into closed session to consider the naming of a facility at UW Superior. And I assume we take that up in closed session?
Correct.
So with that item, that concludes the report of the Physical Planning and Funding Committee.
Thank you very much. Regent Spector?
May I ask a question that's relevant to physical planning, but not this specific agenda?
Yes, I would consider that as a question under additional or unfinished business.
I attended a seminar over the weekend about green buildings in the context of law firms, it turned out. But I'm wondering, and I learned that there are standards that have now been come forth about that. I'm wondering if we, when we build new buildings, are aware of that, if we seek to meet those standards. Just briefly, David.
I should have mentioned it, David, sorry.
We are embarking on several new buildings that will be LEED Silver or Gold or almost Gold certified. In addition, the State Division of State Facilities has adopted its own set of stringent guidelines for green building that are to be followed for all projects that are really LEED Silver equivalent, and then whether or not the project wants to get the plaque is really up to the agency, whether or not you pay the additional fees to go through the certification process. But yes, the state is actually following all those guidelines in energy efficiency and design.
I thought you were going to mention that the residential hall project at UW Whitewater, which I mentioned during the report, is indeed going to be LEED Silver certified, and we call it almost gold, right?
Correct.
Could I say, Regent Spector, that before you asked your question, I thought green buildings in the context of law firms were buildings where the law firms made even more money.
I'm going to rule that out of order.
Big surprise there.
Any additional resolutions that anyone likes to have, or any petitions or memorials or other unfinished business? If not, I'd like to not take a 10-minute recess and go right into closed session if the Vice